Next, let's talk about the foundations upon which curriculum are built. And you can think of foundations as forces that act on or influence individuals who are responsible for creating curricula. And there are 5 major foundations that we will explore in this session. We'll look at the philosophical, the historical, the psychological, the sociological, and economic foundations of curriculum. So we're probably all familiar with the 3 main branches of philosophy if you had any kind of intro to philosophy class when you were an undergraduate. But just as a quick review, metaphysics, of course, deals with reality and what is real. Epistemology deals with knowledge and how we understand and know things. And axiology deals with values. So foundations, in terms of looking at the philosophical foundations of curriculum, what we want to really think about is that curriculum does not arise in a vacuum. If we aren't clear about our philosophy of education, our curriculum and our teaching becomes confused and it becomes inconsistent. Philosophy provides kind of the starting point for decision making. It gives designers of curriculum a framework for planning and evaluating curriculum. It helps us deal with our own personal systems of belief and values, the way we perceive the world around us, and how we define what is important to us. And it's always influenced society, and it's always influenced institutions of learning. But particularly, of course, when we're talking about curriculum, we're really looking at educational philosophy. So we want to take a look at things like perennialism. And perennialism is really when the focus of the curriculum is on classical subjects. So things like literary analysis. And in this theory and philosophy of curriculum is seen as a constant. Advocates look at the permanence of knowledge that have sort of stood the test of time. So according to this philosophy, education is absolutely constant. It's universal. It's heavily subject-centered, and it relies on very defined, clearly defined disciplines. The content is very logically organized, and the subjects are taught separately. So history is history, biology is biology. Things are not mixed together. And learners are regarded kind of as lacking judgment on what should be studied. So you sometimes hear this philosophy creeping into language when people say, well, the students don't really understand what they need to know. That's a perennialism kind of viewpoint. Often, again, curriculum in this philosophy, if it's very strictly adhered to, are going to be things like teaching Latin and Greek and classical subjects. So that's one philosophy of education. The next one that we want to think about is progressivism. And this theory and philosophy of education focused on the learner's interests. It looked at human problems and human affairs. The subjects are very interdisciplinary and integrative, and they're interactive. And when you hear people talking about a quote-unquote liberal education, this is the philosophy which that's built upon. So this is actually grew out of a protest against perennialism starting in the 1920s and the 1930s, where the focus was on now problem solving and scientific inquiry. And it was felt that learning should include a cooperative behavior and self-discipline. So when you hear people using terms like self-directed learning, that's definitely coming out of a progressive point of view. It's very interdisciplinary in nature, and it's a rejection of this idea that the teacher is the all-important authoritarian and the students must memorize facts through drilling and constant, testing. And it's the teacher who gets to say what's important and what you need to know. So progressivism kind of grew out of a protest against that, and it was a brand new movement. Which brings us to the next philosophy, educational philosophy that came along, which was essentialism. And essentialism was kind of a throwback and a bit of a protest against progressivism. So here's when you hear these sort of back to basic ideologies. What students should be studying are the 3 R's. That is the idea behind essentialism, that there's just essential subjects that should be studied. and that teachers play a directive role by disseminating information to the learners. So the position is reflected when people say that the standards of education are being lowered. Well, we're just lowering our standard to let these other students in. This is a viewpoint that's sort of grounded in essentialism. There's this caused in our K-12 education system a widespread implementation of competency-based programs and standardized testing. Excuse me. Essentialism is often behind the attacks on education from the media and other groups. So the students aren't learning what we think they should be learning. That is kind of where essentialism is coming into our public discourse. Then finally, the last philosophy we'll look at is Reconstructionism, which is a focus on the present and future trends and issues of national and international issues. So it really looks at learning being at the forefront of remaking a society. And it's a belief that schooling shapes the values of an entire generation. It promotes social, economic, and political education. Subject matters are used as a vehicle for addressing social problems. And it's based on the idea that we have enough discipline-based education and narrow specialization, and we need to look more broadly at our human problems. So you see this where you see community-based education and issues of that nature coming into the curriculum. That's coming right out of this movement of Reconstructionism. So that's a lot of philosophy, I recognize, but it's very important for our understanding of how curriculums actually develop. And next, we're going to look at another foundation, which is historical. And the historical foundation of curriculum looks at the role of curriculum in national achievements. So when you think of something like the space race that went on in the 1960s, this was very much grounded in this idea of our curriculum created this sort of national push towards science education. It really, again, guides the future planning of curriculum and factors that influence the development of a nation's unity. It eliminates kind of historic traditions and useless traditions. So you're looking at, in our medical field, one of the historical perspectives that we want to understand is Abraham Flexner, who obviously had a great deal of influence on the way medical schools operate, developed, and the standards to which they were held. So there's always that historical perspective of what's happening in the history of the country and in the history of the field itself. And next, we want to look at the psychological foundations. The psychological foundations of curriculum give us a lot of insight into cognition, areas of child development, theories of learning, learning processes, different teaching methods, different evaluation methods. All of this is born out of a psychological orientation of curriculum. And we're going to look at a couple of different psychological theories, including, of course, behaviorism, where learning focuses on observable changes in behavior, changes in what people say or do. So think in terms of course, if you remember your Intro to Psychology course, you remember Pavlov's dogs, the dogs that salivated when the bell rang, and his classical conditioning and reinforcements, rewards, punishments, and all of that. Well, where that influenced curriculum was in using rewards, breaking down larger tasks into smaller bite-sized chunks, reinforcing certain behavior and punishing other behavior, modeling behavior whenever you see that mentioned in teaching. That comes right out of this behaviorist tradition, establishing clear learning outcomes, which is something I advocate for all the time. And clearly that focuses on that change in what people can know or do. It is really important in a medical context when you're talking about things like procedures. We have very clear guidelines of what we want someone to be able to do at the end of that learning. It also focuses on things like frequent feedback, especially for difficult concepts or complicated skills. Because when you think about, the bit by bit way that they sort of train animals at SeaWorld, that's a behaviorist approach. And so when we're breaking down difficult ideas or difficult tasks into smaller, more achievable tasks, that's coming right out of a behaviorist point of view. The next theory is cognitive, of course, which focuses on how information is received, how it's assimilated, how it's stored, how it's recalled. So it really focuses on information processing and how the brain processes information between sensory, short-term, and long-term memory. So one of course, the leading advocates in this field is Piaget, who we talked about in the first class on learning theory. And he has those cognitive developmental stages. Where this comes again in teaching really comes down to things like the importance of gaining learners' attention before you launch into something so that they can actually be paying attention, and using cue signals like saying things in class like, now this is really important, or I want you to take this down, write this down. Those are cue signals that help a learner process information. Moving around the room and changing your vocal tone and inflection, identifying key information by using handouts, the board, using slides, presenting information in an organized, logical sequence, going from more simple concepts to more complex concepts. That all comes out of cognitive theory. Presenting information in categories to encourage inductive reasoning, providing opportunities for learners to elaborate. So, in a medical clinical environment, something like the Socratic questioning, or what sometimes is called pimping method, comes right out of this cognitive theory of, trying to get students to elaborate. What do you think that means? Why did you make that diagnostic choice? What led you to that conclusion? Questions like that. Also using memory aids like mnemonics, old carts would be a good example. Using imagery techniques to help encourage memorization. Using repetition by previewing what you're going to learn and reviewing what you learned in a particular lesson. Those all came into the development of curriculum through this psychological foundation of cognitive theory. And there's two more we're going to look at. And we talked at length on some of these theories in the last class on teaching and learning theory, if you took that class. The next, of course, is constructivism, which is Vygotsky, and it focuses on how learners create or construct their own knowledge by constantly sorting and organizing incoming information and experience. And Vygotsky felt that the environment had a powerful effect on learning, and the community influences the values, beliefs, norms, and habits, behaviors of a culture. So again, where this comes into teaching is by encouraging independent thinking. Learners are responsible for their own learning. So when you say independent, self-directed learning, that comes right out of this theory. A higher level of thinking is encouraged. So when you think about things like Bloom's taxonomy and trying to encourage higher order thinking, that's coming right out of here. Learners are encouraged to challenge hypotheses and engage in critical thinking. So when you're talking in a scientific or medical environment, obviously challenging hypotheses is a big part of what we want learners to do, and also engaging in critical and clinical reasoning is also a very big part of what we're asking. So the curriculum, using a constructive approach, focuses on big concepts and understands that knowledge is dynamic and ever-changing. There's all kinds of new information coming in on a regular basis. And, of course, in the medical field, we see that all the time, new information, new studies, new drugs, new drug interactions. All of the new discoveries are coming at us. We're bombarded with that new information all the time. And then finally, when we're looking at the psychological foundations of curriculum, the last psychological theory to consider is humanism. And humanism, of course, focuses on emotions and self-efficacy. It focuses on intrinsic motivations, and there's where you get things like Maslow's needs hierarchy, and one of its key proponents, of course, was Carl Rogers. And in teaching, where that comes into play is that we see that the teacher is the facilitator, they're sensitive to the learner's feelings, there's a general belief that all learners can learn. Usually using this theory, the teacher is trying to establish a warm, democratic, non-threatening, positive learning environment. When you hear people like me talking about creating a good learning environment, that's coming out of a humanist tradition. It focuses a lot on self-esteem and self-concept. Teachers' role should, be a role model and setting a good example. And learners are often given choices within limitations and a certain amount of freedom. So whenever you see someone say, select among these 3 different projects, which one you find more interesting, that's from a humanist point of view. Learning is very much based on discovery, exploration, experimentation. So that really is a kind of fast view of psychological theory as it relates to foundations of curriculum. Next, another foundation of curriculum and where it's coming from is the sociological foundation. And of course, sociology is the study of social relationships and human behavior within groups. And so this sociological foundation of curriculum focuses on the values of society. It looks at media influences. It looks at underlying culture. It understands that schools exist within and not apart from the larger society. And it's also sees part of curriculum's role as transmitting the social heritage, the norms and values of a given society. So curriculum should be based on the problems and the needs of a society. So when you hear people saying, well, we need more focus on climate change or something like that, that's a sociological point of view. We're addressing issues of concern. Schooling is a way of transmitting the values of the culture and increasing patriotism. So here you see things like when I was growing up, we said the Pledge of Allegiance in school every day. That comes right out of this sociological tradition. Used to be in high school, you did a lot of civics classes where you learned about the government and how great America was. That was, again, a sociological foundation of the curriculum at that time. And finally, the last area of foundation that we'll explore is the economic. And this is really, we see this a lot today, which is a focus on skill development. When you hear people criticizing some of the humanities and saying, well, what's somebody going to do with a, art history major? That we should be churning out more people in technology and science fields and STEM-related fields. That has an economic foundation of looking at what skill development is necessary, what job opportunities are necessary. When you hear people talking about return on investment and you see articles in the newspaper saying, is college worth it? That's definitely an economical foundation of curriculum. And this really has a tremendous influence both in K through 12 education and in higher education when it comes to things like allegations of funds. We see this when we see how college used to be seen as a social good, and the government and the state and governments supported it at a very large percentage, and that percentage of support coming from governmental institutions has shrunk as people are more focused on college being a personal good. In other words, why should I help you send your kid to college? Because if college is about getting a good career and a good job, why should I support that? Where it used to be seen as college as a way to improve society and to create, cures for cancer and do all this good among society. And that's something, of course, that the community would be much more eager to support. So we see, this foundation coming in when you hear, well, we lack a certain type of skilled workers. When I was an undergraduate many, many years ago, everybody was being pushed into the engineering field. And then a few years down the line, engineers couldn't get jobs because there were so many of them had graduated from these programs. And we saw that same thing play out not too many years ago when everybody was pushing people into computer science and coding. And then that started to being outsourced, and those people were left without a lot of opportunity. So there are these economic influences on what we focus on in our curriculum. So in this foundation, education is really seen as an engine for economic development within a country or society. So what does that all mean? Why are we talking about this? What is important about this? Because it's helpful for us to step back and understand that foundations, whether consciously or unconsciously, are shaping our worldview and our philosophical assumptions about our relationship to this content that we teach to our learners. And those foundations shape our worldviews on how we approach teaching and research. And those assumptions about the world influence the paradigms and the theoretical frameworks that we espouse when we're teaching.